So welcome back all of you to the workshop. So today we have here with us Dr. Nadia. She's a lecturer in social psychology at the Montfort University, UK. She has completed her BSc in psychology and MSc in cross-cultural psychology. She did her PhD with the focus on social and development psychology from Scotland. Now her primary research interest lies in the field of social psychology and focusing on the self and identity processes in children and adolescents. So she's also a partner of our MeHeLP conference, of MeHeLP project. Nadia, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Archer. Right. So hopefully you were able to join Menti in this time. If not, you can do it at any point that I'm talking. But hopefully it's interactive. So do feel free to put your videos on, to unmute yourself and to engage, or use the chat here, or use the space within Menti as well. So there's many different ways for you to engage with this, but I do want to have for it to be a conversation. I want us to have a chat about this, and if I can help you learn about how we adapt scales and why we should, that's the main point, then great. So, okay. So, I'm assuming everybody can hear me. We can use this as a test drive for Menti. You can use this to vote and engage with that. So I'm assuming you can all hear me. Yes, we have a couple of people. Fantastic. Excellent. The system works. That's part of it, isn't it? Okay. So if we start first, but a bit of a reflection. So when we're doing research, when we're doing statistics, when we're doing t-tests and things like that, we're in a way relying on averages, right? We're relying on statistical averages. So reflect on what an average person looks like to you. So if I say, imagine an average person, what are they like? Just in your mind's eye, there has to be a person. Anybody wants to share what they came up with? Who is that person? What do they look like? This is usually a bit of a quiet.
We are trying to define average.
That it's a tricky one, isn't it? So
Yeah.
if you think through that, what gender is your person when you're trying to define it? What is their race? What about their ethnicity? What about their age? How old are they? Do they have a religion? And if so, what religion is it? What do they have a disability? What do they do for a living? Your average person. What are his hobbies? Is she married? Does he have children? What does she look like? How does he dress? What is her financial situation? How many years of education has he completed? How many friends does she have? Those are very important aspects of what makes a person, right? And how many of them did you imagine? Did you hit on all of them? Did your average person look a little bit like you, maybe? In their characteristics, in their gender, in their position in life, etc. And to reflect on that is quite important, because we bring those expectations of averages, those expectations who our average person is, who it is that we're researching, who it is that we are narrowing things down to. It's very important because we bring our own biases with that, right? Our own experiences, our own expectations, that color how we see the world, color how we interpret the data, how we collect data, because we orient towards an average, a general person that is very, very similar to some extent to ourselves. So it's important to be critical, right, in our research process, that to be inclusive of the different races, religions, genders, ages, disability, all of that, and many more factors that did not fit on this page, okay? So hopefully we're in agreement with that. So your average person is different from someone else's, depending on your experiences, including those related to culture, right? So my average will be different to yours because of where I come from, what my cultural background is, what my expectations are. Okay. Now, if we're looking at how to embed it in research, it's important to have a distinction between an emic and an etic perspective of research. Are you guys familiar with emic, etic? It's always hard to where to pitch. The emic, etic distinctions, hopefully you've heard of them, you're familiar with them to some extent. So, for example, these terms come from phonetics. And language studies. So phonemics and phonetics. Phonetics, the sounds that are pronounced in all languages. Phonemics is a specific sound that is, and this is my cat, that is pronounced within a specific language, like your aggressive R in French, that is very, very specific, right? It's a phonemic. So from there, your etic. Okay, if you're not speaking, can I ask you to try and mute yourself because I'm getting some foreign noises. So an etic is an aspect of culture. It's a perspective, takes perspective of an outsider, and we're looking at human universals. We're looking at replication of of psychological constructs across different cultures. And also with emic research, what you're interested in is those cultural specifics, those things within the culture that are unique to that context. And it may be a reinterpretation of an etic in a very emic, culturally specific way. What a lot of research tends to do, if they don't adapt measures that were created in the West, and sadly a lot of measures that are created in the West and just transplanted into a different cultural context without considerations of adaptation, for example, would become an imposed etic. It's an assumption that whatever construct and its aspects were developed in a Western culture are equally translatable to anywhere else. You might take, for example, Kohlberg's stages of moral development and say, okay, let's find the same moral stages of development everywhere else in the world. And the implications then are, if you don't find them, that somehow they didn't get developed. Okay, so there's very important implications for what we conclude from research that doesn't involve cultural adaptation. For example, an emic construct of ahimsa, right? An Indian principle of nonviolence based on respect to all life will be completely missing from Western Kohlberg's model of moral development. So you're missing a lot. Your interpretations are not as culturally sound. So what we need to do is have derived ethics and a derived process through which we can take a construct that is universal, but develop it into a culturally meaningful representation in our scale. So very quickly, if I were to give you such universals or ethics as mental health, right? We all have mental health, or recovery. We all experience recovery to some extent. Expression of emotion. We all have emotion. We all express it. Or health in general. Can you think of any emic expressions of those ethics? Any Indian, for example, relevant expressions of this? And please feel free to chip in or note in the chat. Archa, can I pick on you? And put you on the spot. Is there any emics from our project that you would highlight as something as culturally specific in terms of literacy, for example? So if you have an etic such as mental health or recovery or expression of emotion, something that we might consider is universal, right? We can find this in any culture. Is there a culturally specific way of representing that?
Mm, I think we didn't get your question.
So, for example, in social relationships, right? We all have social relationships, and so it's a category that exists everywhere. However, a particular type of sort of social relationships based on Guanxi, for example, in China, you have sort of the closeness of a relationship that is associated with a particular set of differentiated behavioral obligations based on social and ethical norms. So, social and ethical regulation of a relationship, a very Chinese way of having close social relationships, right? In the way how they're managed. It's a still social relationship, but it's done in a very specific way relevant to Chinese culture. So I guess I'm asking you to reflect on the ways in which certain constructs that we're all familiar with and we would expect to find anywhere around the world, like mental health, might be represented in a very culturally specific ways. We for example, you use the word tension. I think that came out quite a bit in interviews and narratives, right, around tension. If I say tension, for example, somewhere here, they won't necessarily know what that means. Yeah. So some of the stigma around mental health being seen as negatively in a particular way might be seen as possession, for example, by a jinn or something like that. Again, it's a very specific belief of causality, for example, that is only relevant to a specific context. So what we're trying to do is take a universal but have a culturally relevant representation of that concept in our scales. So what I want to do now, and so please do log into Menti for this, is measure intelligence. So there's a measure, there's right or wrong answers to here. So please do join. And we will be able to have some they exist, these questions exist, they measure intelligence to see how well they work in different cultural settings. And we'll be able to see the answers, and we'll have a winner as well. So we will be able to track your progress. Okay, great. So, oh, whoops, sorry. Skipped a question for some reason. There we go. So if bad is written as 214, how would you write dig in the same secret writing? So you need to give me an answer to that. All right, your time is up. And the correct answer is 497. So we've had some good answers. Well done. Let's go to the next question. So you're off to the good start then with your intelligence. Well done. Okay. What does it mean if someone says she's buffed? Does that mean she's got a cute rear end? She's overweight, she's wearing leather, or she's got polished manners? Which one is it? So again, you have an example of a question here. Measuring intelligence. The correct answer is she's overweight. So we do have 4 correct answers there. We have quite a few people that are getting it wrong. Okay, not too well here on this question. Next one. Okay, which word is most out of place here? Squib, blood, grey, spook, and black. In this sequence, one word does not make sense. Which one is it? The correct answer is grey. So we have quite a few people that got this one wrong. All right. Question number 4. So I have 2 left. Okay, what number comes next in the sequence? 1, 2, 3, blank. All right, so we have some answers in the chat. All right, people think it's 4. The correct answer is many. So we didn't have anybody getting this one right. Okay, last question. Let's see how you do this. We eat food and we blank water. What is the blank? Okay, we have drink, we have pure water. Some answers. The correct answer is eat. Again, we didn't have anybody answering this correctly. Let's see, do we have a winner for this quiz? Here's your leaderboard. All right, well done, Venture. Whoever you are, you get the bragging rights. You won the quiz. You're very intelligent. I have failed this quiz for the first time I've done it, so I, I completely empathize with you. Let me give you a bit of context for where these questions are coming from. So, first of all, these were, as I promised, real questions of intelligence. Now, we got the first one right, didn't we? So if bad is written as 214, you create number per letter code and you decode this question. Very straightforward. We all generally get it. The next 2 questions came from an intelligence test designed for African Americans in the US in the 70s. So they particularly looked at assessing the knowledge of street language in this group, in this context at that particular time point. If you're not that group of people, generally you're just guessing. I was, and I think the majority of you were as well. So here you have an example of, again, questions that are claiming they're measuring intelligence applied to a different group here in India, and it just doesn't work. According to those questions, you're not very intelligent. Okay, the last 2 questions are from Edward River Australian Aboriginal community in North Queensland, and specifically looking at this community's intelligence within their language group. So in their language, they do not have a counting system that goes beyond 3. Can they not count? Yes, they can. They just do it differently. Okay, so these questions apply to them. They don't apply to you. So by their standards, by the standards of this Aboriginal community, you're again not intelligent because you cannot answer these questions. Again, we eat food and we eat water. They do not have a word for drink. Can they not communicate it? Of course they can. It's just measured differently. It's said differently. Again, highlighting the importance of adjusting and adapting your questionnaires to local cultures. Because if you set out to find intelligence with these measures in our group, we haven't done so well. Okay, so hopefully this should sit a little bit uncomfortably with you right now about the assumptions that we make when we do these tests. So how would you feel if this test was used to decide whether you get a job, whether you get a promotion, whether you access education, all of those things? And a lot of times assessment and testing is not just for research, but it is to put somebody on a particular scale in terms of intelligence and their mental health and their diagnosis and their treatment and all of those things. So if the test is flawed, if the test is not addressing its biases, what happens is you're not actually finding what you've set out to find. All it is, you're replicating whatever impression of the average that you carry or the researcher carried when they've developed a scale in a particular cultural context. Yeah. Okay. So this is what Porteous did. So, the very, very famous Porteous, who has done research in intelligence. He used the mazes that you see on the right there is exactly the measures that he used. He assumed that if you can complete a maze quickly, it means you are intelligent. And it is universal way in which you can measure intelligence. So he went around the world and he measured this, and he found out that tribes in Kalahari Desert are the least intelligent of them all. Obviously, it's extremely racist. Obviously, it's inaccurate. But he has made 3 mistakes in this assumption that we still can make today. One is about equivalence. It's about assuming that intelligence measure is universal, i.e., you can use maze tests to adequately and accurately measure intelligence in any culture across the world. The same assumption we can make about using the same scale and measure whatever that scale is measuring equally in every context. It implies that the scores are comparable or equivalent across groups, meaning the scale of depression, if you're high on that scale in one country and low on the other, it can be comparable. And they're measuring the same thing, even though we know that depression, for example, can present very differently in different cultural contexts. It is assuming generalization, meaning that your scores that you find somehow indicate innate intelligence. So that jump from a score that you got on a measure to some sort of innate quality is a very dangerous jump. Our scales always have very limited representation, a very complex thing, right? So your Rosenberg self-esteem scale has 12 items. Is your self-esteem reducible to 12 items? It isn't. So we always need to be very critical when we generalize, right, to kind of possession of that construct. And variance, it's about, he assumed that samples of individuals equal cultures, right? So aggregated scores on a cultural level mean the same thing and on a lower level. We need to recognize individual differences. We need to recognize impact of gender, of race, of religion, of education, of socioeconomic status. All of that are individual level differences that will impact how a certain sample that you've gathered in your scale rates on it, and not imply cultural differences when we're doing comparisons. Okay, so again, those 3 things, try not to fall into those, be aware of them, be very critical in your work with scales of those 3 things. How can we do that? How can we actually adapt properly? So we need to look at equivalence from a psychological standpoint. We need to make sure that the concept that we're looking at, for example, depression, in our case, mental health literacy, is meaningful in a cultural context. The scales are usually developed within only one language, right? So it's a lot of work to develop a scale across many, many languages. Nobody hardly ever does it. So a good example is South African personality inventory that was developed across different contexts. So they took 11 language groups in South Africa and done qualitative work with them first. They developed a conceptual model of personality in South Africa and then developed a scale based on that conceptual model. And yes, they found something very similar to Big Five, fantastic. But they also found an enhanced representation of social relational concepts that you do not have in Big Five. So if they just took Big Five measure and did it everywhere, they'd just find that. But they would ignore the cultural specificity of what personality is. Social relatedness is very important in South Africa and probably in India, actually. And as a consequence, that would have been missed if they just took the Western model and did an imposed ETIC approach. Okay. So how can you adapt them, right? So there's 3 things. 1, adoption, 2, adaptation, and 3, assembling, right? So we usually hear about translating and back translating, and therefore your job's done, it makes sense in language, and you're finished. No, don't do that. Please don't do that. And I'll explain why. So adoption is your close translation. Essentially, you're saying the problem is the language. The original scale is in English. We need to translate it to Hindi, and bam, it's going to work. Okay, fine. Adaptation, sorry, is when you include some modifications in language, in meaning. For example, if a depression scale has I feel blue in English, and it makes sense, you feel sad, etc. If you translate this to Russian, my native tongue, what you will be saying is I'm gay. That is not direct translation, right? Direct translation of words creates a completely different meaning in a cultural context. Word-wise, linguistically, it works. Meaning-wise, not so much. This is where adaptation is more important. It's more relevant because you're working with vernacular, with sense of what that construct is in a cultural setting. Assembly is where you're developing new parts. You develop new items. You may be developing a new subscale, like for example, with a personality scale before. You're adding new stuff to it. How do you as a researcher decide which one do you do, adoption, adaptation, or assembly? You determine whether there is a possibility of bias, right? So if you expect to have a method or a construct bias, i.e. the way of delivery of questionnaire or the construct itself looks and feels and presents differently. For example, depression is not understood as a psychological thing, but about in terms of the items that, sorry, this really threw me. Are
No,
we ending?
no, we have 10 more minutes.
Okay, so don't jump ship just yet. Okay. So in terms of where was I? Yes, so if you have some sort of bias, what you need to do is adapt the questionnaire, right? So if you think that depression, for example, as I said, is not psychological, but it's more somatic, you're experiencing more somatic physiological symptoms and your scale doesn't tap on those, that's a problem because you're not picking up the way depression is presented in your cultural context. So there needs to be adaptation. If you don't think that there is bias, adoption is perfectly great because just translate it, it allows more comparability between contexts. But the issue is if there is bias, you're ignoring it with just doing an adoption. Now, in terms of how to do it, again, you can look at the concept itself, and this is very well discussed in the reference below. Again, we only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but you can adopt for concept that you're looking at. So say depression, how does it look across different cultures? Culture specifically in terms of conventional norms, values, and belief systems. In terms of language that you're using, in terms of how language is used in that context, or specific measurement that you're employing within your scale. And so again, there's processes for all of that, and you might need to consider what am I adapting to. A lot of research suggests this kind of translation part of, as I said, a part of your adaptation, looking at the linguistic aspect of things and doing sort of back translations, etc. Modern research advocates for more committee approach instead of back translation, specifically because you can look at your committee as a resource not only on a linguistic level, but on a kind of cultural level. They know the norms, they know the values. That's what we've done, Archer, with, we've had group meetings. We're like, well, what does this mean? And should we do this? And it was hours of deliberation between bilingual individuals who are carriers of culture and saying, this won't make sense. They don't understand this. And you went to communities and done cognitive interviews for that as well. So your process of adaptation does need to include qualitative and quantitative measures. You do need to talk to people. There's no way around it. You cannot limit this as a just linguistic exercise. If you have done that, for example, one research have looked at it and just done literal linguistic translations, There were semantic issues. For example, terms like bothered are quite a bit, very, very vague. What do they mean in terms of language? Again, varies in context quite a bit. Some of the cultural aspects of quality of life, such as eating fresh food, are plain not applicable in an Indian or a Thai context, because that's not part of the diet. The diet is very, very different. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to understand what eating fresh food means. Is it freshly prepared? Is it just an apple? What does this mean? So these things become very, very vague in your items, and then you get varied responses because people are not sure what they're answering about, as opposed to them not having quality of life. And that's the problem. So, for example, the Brislin reference here gives you quite a bit of insight into adapting particular sentences or particular items and what you need to avoid within that. So again, I'm very happy to share these PDFs with you guys if you want to look at the references. Now, there are guidelines, and again, here's plenty of resources here in terms of how you adapt, but working in multidisciplinary teams, looking at linguistic, conceptual aspects, as well as the stats that come after, right? You can use statistics to help you understand the structure in terms of your scale that you've developed, right? Do things load together the same way? Do some items just plain not work? The statistics will help you do that if you do confirmatory and exploratory factor analyses. So be very, very careful with bias. And if you think that there is bias, always add, I would say, qualitative work. We had researchers do cognitive interviews, which is a very specific way of interviewing. It's not kind of tell me about yourself type of thing, but you come there with a measure and you speak to the community where you want to administer the measure, and you go item by item and you say, well, what do you mean by this? You know, does this all make sense to you? What about this word? What about that word? How would you answer it? And they can give you insights and saying, well, this doesn't make sense to me. Well, who do you mean by this? And what do you mean by that? And then you come and then with the team, you go through those interviews and say, all right, well, that clearly doesn't work. We need to adapt it, because when we actually do take it to a community, if that doesn't make sense to them, we're not measuring anything. So how can we conclude about whatever we're measuring, mental health literacy, depression, whatever, if it didn't make sense to people where you administered it? So again, it's not a lone wolf kind of project either. You need to talk to people, you need to involve other people, and it's a long process if you're doing it correctly. Having transparency of the procedure helps. So for example, on the right here, you can see the steps for our adaptation process. We will be publishing this. So you'll be able to see just how much effort has gone into it. So it's over a year now that we've been doing it. So we're in a second pilot at the moment for the MeHeLP. But I think that's it. I think this was a very speedy run through. I appreciate for your patience. This ended up being a bit of more of a lecture than it was a seminar. But again, any questions or comments now or via email, I'm very happy to engage with you on that.